we wanted to start with a sort of disclaimer in a way. The vantage which we speak from is not global in terms of moving across traditions, and it's not even going to be comprehensive within any particular traditions, in fact. But nonetheless, I hope that by going deeper within the spiritual terrains that we do know, that might actually prompt deeper resonances with how love is talked about elsewhere that you may well know of yourself. And also, we're going to be speaking about differences as well as similarities, because differences often take us to a point where we can see more than we perhaps knew before. So it's in that spirit we want to tease out differences as well as spot similarities. We have 10 or so areas that we've staked out where love touches various facets of life, from what love might be, love as a path, creation, suffering, friendship, erotic love, charity, God's love, these kind of things. And I'll ask Jane just to say how she addresses these matters from her own learning. But for myself, it's someone who has learnt from Christianity and Platonism in particular, rather than say standing as some sort of official within the Christian tradition. And that's what I should be drawing on. But Jane, that makes sense to you, I hope.
Yes, and so I should put a proviso that, you know, I am steeped in the tradition that came out of Ibn Arabi, who was a 12th century philosopher and mystic who was born in Spain and moved into the heartlands of Islam later in his life. He was a tremendously, I justify my specialization in Ibn Arabi because he was an enormously influential figure throughout the following 700 years after his death. So, and still today, actually. So talking about Ibn Arabi, you're not talking about a niche figure within Islam, but you are talking about a specific kind of a figure, and somebody who was a practicing Sufi master in the way that he lived. So we're looking very much at a Sufi perspective here, and it is very different from the kind of what we call more fundamentalist perspective that we find around the world today with people like the Taliban or ISIS or whatever. So just that proviso, first of all, to say we're looking at that strand.
Yes, and for myself, although drawing on Platonism and Christianity, in a way they're two separate traditions, but I'll be thinking particularly about Christian mysticism, and then the Platonic insights come close once more. But look, to get us going, we thought that we could each take 4 terms to start scoping out what might be meant by this one word in English, love. I picked 4 Greek terms. I think Jane's got 4 Arabic terms up her sleeve. So let me just get us going with the 4 Greek familiar terms, probably: Eros, philia, storge, and agape. And let me just do storge first, because it's probably the one we'll speak least about now. Storge is familial love. It's the love that belongs to you by virtue of your belonging, say in a family or even a city-state in a particular place and time. I'll come to agape shortly. Eros and philia. So Eros as in erotic love, and then philia as in friendship. Now, these terms aren't always so distinct as you might like them to be when you actually come to read them in texts. So particularly in Plato, philia can mean a kind of passionate love of, and eros can mean a kind of admiration from afar as much as from an intimacy. But nonetheless, these are the kind of loves that in Plato are key to awakening or liberation. They're the loves which lead the prisoner out of the cave, to recall his famous analogy. And they draw us from the prison of a limited perspective on reality by our desire for what's good. The good, the beautiful, the true reach to us even when we aren't aware of what's drawing us. And that experience of being drawn over what seems like a horizon is the operation of love, which is to say that these kind of loves, Eros and philia, erotic love, friendship, are excessive loves. It's love that leads us to more than we realized, even as we were first loving. And that also means that they're the loves that change us, Eros and philia. We must change in order to appreciate that to which they draw us, because they're the kind of ways of knowing, as is implied by the word love, that is about resonance. It's about opening. It's about a felt perception of things as much as one that might be discerned and articulated by reason. So these are the kind of loves that don't only lead to knowledge, but they lead to virtue as well. Because when we are drawn by these loves into wider connection with reality, we take on the virtues of that wider reality in our knowing. Plus, it takes virtues to embark on this quest of love, virtues like courage and prudence, understanding, and so on. Couple more thoughts to sort of build into that basic sense, which we'll unpack in different ways, but it's also to associate love, though, with a kind of divine madness, as Plato does. If love is the longing for more than what we understand, it's to say we move out of our comprehension and may have ecstatic moments of madness or just moments of confusion. That is the gift of what's beyond us to us, felt through these kind of loves. And hence Plato likened following love to falling in love, the common human experience, which is both the sense of unity and kind of craziness, but which the sage or the mystic or visionary has developed into standing in love, being in love, which again is a kind of pattern that the everyday human experience of erotic love or friendship would mirror in some way. So that's to say something about Eros and philia, particularly in Plato. When you move into Christian mysticism, agape takes a major part. If you do a search through ancient Greek texts before Christianity, agape actually doesn't appear very much at all. But say in the New Testament, agape is the most common word for love in the Greek. I believe over 200 times it appears. And this signals a very substantial change, which there's more to say about, but just to touch on it now, this is the kind of love that, unlike Eros and philia, is not based on desire, but is based on what you might call abundance or amplification. It is not satisfied like a lack is satisfied. It rejoices in knowing more and more. And so it's closely associated with God and God's love in Christian mysticism. So I hope that gives a bit of a starter for the different kinds of love. There are the loves like storge, familiar love, belonging kind of love, which we probably won't say so much about tonight. These two, certainly in the Greek and Christian mystical traditions of Eros and philia, which are these loves that draw us, change us, and connect us in knowing and felt ways. And then in Christianity, agape, which is in a way the divine love reaching us as much as we reach up to it, a love that speaks of abundance rather than just the sense of desire or longing. Jane, what are your four loves like?
Okay. So perhaps I'll just begin by saying that very much as you've been describing, actually, within Islam, love is seen much more like a kind of force or a power than as just an emotion as such. It is very, very much, as you say, that which takes us beyond ourselves. It's seen as a power which will drive us out of our familiar patterns. In cases when you come to mystical Islamic poetry, I mean, it drives people to leave their homelands, to leave their families, to travel, etc. So it's this motivation to find out more. And I was very much struck by the talk that you gave last week, in which you described love in Plato as a kind of energy. And I think that's very, very much how that would be seen within the tradition. I think also it's important to say that, within Islam, everything is seen as a kind of mode of divine love. Even if it appears in human love, everything is seen from really as a sort of emanating or having its root in God's love for us, or God's love for the world. But in Ibn Arabi, in his great long chapter, he has a huge chapter in his masterwork, the Meccan Revelations, which is the longest chapter on love, chapter 178. And he identifies 4 types of love there. I think a couple of which might sort of overlap with the Greek concepts. So the most common word for love is hub. And this is always used for the divine love. And it's the most common word within Arabic as well. If you listen to Arabic love songs, it's Habibi, Habibi, which is from the same root, my love, my love, my love. This is the same thing. So hub is the kind of purest form of love. And as with Arabic, he has this kind of particular structure of the language where every word is sort of tied to a 3-letter root, and every 3-letter root has a kind of imagery and a sort of metaphorical universe that develops around it. And so for hub, the related root is that of a seed. So haba is a seed and hub is love. So this is the kind of love which would settle in the heart and kind of grow and stay there and be a motivating force over a long period of time. So that's the hub. And then there's ishq, which is intense, passionate love, which I think is quite similar to what you've been just talking about. This is the love where someone goes mad with longing and desire. And this derives from a word from a kind of convolvulus, which is a thing which wraps itself round something else, its object, and grows rapidly upward. So this is the kind of ecstatic love which kind of shoots you into the stratosphere. And it's the most common word used within Islamic mystical poetry for its passion, really, love and passion. And then there's a word called wad, which is translated as affection or its loving kindness. And so this is a fixed form of love. Its imagery is of a tent peg. So this is the kind of love which is quite the opposite of ishq, really. It's the kind of steadying, grounded kind of love. And the way that Ibn Arabi describes these loves is not so much that they're separate as that they're interacting with each other. So the wad kind of love is the kind of love which will balance out and ground the ishq. So you get a dynamic there. And it's also wadud. The word wadud is commonly used for friendship. So this is the kind of love that would be, affection that you'd find in friendship. And it's also a reward. It says a Quranic verse which says, those who believe and work righteous deeds, God will grant them wadud. So this is a kind of reward love. And then the last kind of love is called hawa. And this is complex, and I'm not sure that I'm going to fully get hawa. So this has 2 related lines of meaning, one of which is to descend, and one of which is the wind. So these are the 2 lines of meaning. And so the descent is very much what we mean by falling in love. So when we say that we fall, so it's this feeling of falling, but it's also a feeling that it's a kind of love that can take you into low places. So how it also has roots in the chasm. So this can be, some people have described it, it can be the pounding kind of love, the kind of love that grinds you down. But then it has this other kind of meaning, which is to do with the wind. So it's kind of a fanciful kind of a love. It's the kind of love of glittery, superficial things, or the kind of things that as you're going along the way, you might get distracted by some sort of superficial beauty. So this is often translated as whimsy or fancy. So however, it's more complex to describe, but these are the four kind of modalities Ibn Arabi identifies. And as I say, they interact with each other.
Thank you very much. That is already helping expand the sense of these things, and I hope leads naturally to the second way we want to approach this, which is to think about love and the spiritual path. And I thought I could say something about how this has unfolded in the Neoplatonic traditions and then Christianity, and then I'll hand back to you, Jane, again. The point about moving on to the Neoplatonic tradition at this juncture is that with figures like Plotinus and his followers, a monotheistic perception of reality has emerged. It's being born, I think, in Plato, but it's another few centuries, particularly the centuries that see Christianity emerging as well, often through the Hellenistic connections between Judaism and the Greek traditions, that monotheism emerges, and it gives a new inflection on the idea of love, because in a way, one of the questions in Plotinus is, what does the one, as Plotinus speaks of the one God, the one divine source origin, know of love? And this is quite a question in the Christian tradition as well. Plotinus, I think, sees Eros in the one, in at least the sense that when we know of the one in our own soul, we feel our soul erotically charged. And this might produce peak ecstatic experiences, as Plotinus was said to have had when he knew of his unity with the one. And it's also to do with how this sense of unity reaches beyond the mind. So the charged ecstatic sense of the one's erotic presence within us leads us beyond the rational again in Plotinus. And so knowing it in that way is knowing of the one in that way as well. It's the presence of the one in the soul. And so also is the desire to join with the one that the person on the spiritual path following Plotinus would seek and try to follow, and would know, particularly say by the presence of what's beautiful, and following, you might say, the line of beauty. The thing that is distinctive about beauty in these Platonic traditions is that the beautiful is evident to the senses as well as to the mind, whereas the good and the true, these other aspects that love might pick up, aren't seen empirically, and they're known in other ways that the mind can know. But objects in the world speak to us of beauty tangibly in front of us, and so beauty is a particularly important transcendental, to use the more modern word. So it's interesting though to contrast that a bit with iamblichus. So Plotinus is the founding figure, seen now at least, of the Neoplatonic tradition. Iamblichus is in the next generation and differs interestingly from Plotinus, so drawing out the sense of things. And I think in Iamblichus you can say more that philia, the friendship kind of love, is that which is associated with the one. It's the bonds that holds all things together, at least, and also reveals the path of ascent, the return to the one, in Iamblichus more than in Plotinus. Although Iamblichus does recognize Eros, sometimes Eros in these traditions is called the first god, because if there's the one and then the emanation into all things, at that moment of emanation, Eros is also born, the first god, because that's the longing to return back to the one, which is felt in all things. So it's part of this dynamic of emanation and abundance that's known in the one in the Neoplatonic traditions. And so Eros, Iamblichus would say, is there at not just the inception in time, as it were, but constantly through the presence of this dynamic in reality. And also, Iamblichus is interested in how love prompts love. And this is quite well known miracle of the twins, which is in Iamblichus, where Iamblichus sees born in a lake the god Eros, and then also the god Ant-Eros, which can be translated as kind of back love, and so speaks of this dynamic even within the god love itself. It's an old myth that goes back to ancient Greek times, way before Iamblichus's, in Plato's time, in fact. There's a story that there were two lovers on the Acropolis, and one of the lovers was passionately in love with the other, and the first lover was kind of in love, but you know, it was under control, as it were. It hadn't entered the region of madness, and so to test the beloved's love, the first person said, well, look, jump off the Acropolis, never thinking that that would actually happen. But in the madness of love, the lover did indeed jump off the Acropolis, at which point, of course, the first lover jumped off too, realizing the strength of the connection. And where they traditionally landed, there was actually an altar to Eros and Ant-Eros. And the idea there is that Eros needs this back love, Ant-Eros, to kind of ground it. Another version of the myth is that when Eros was born to Aphrodite, he didn't really grow up. He just sort of remained a bit infantile, and his cherub wings remained flabby and his body didn't really strengthen. And Aphrodite went to speak to Demeter, her wise sister, in the woods and said, you know, what should I do? And Demeter said, you need to have another child and call him Ant-Eros. And sure enough, when Eros and Ant-Eros were playing together, kind of testing each other out, but also grounding each other in real life, Eros grew strong and matured, but whenever they were separate, he tended to regress back again. So I just half wondered what you were saying there, Jane, about the love that both can make us go mad, but also force us to sort of put roots in this love and make something of it. It's felt a bit similar to Eros and Ant-Eros.
Yes.
I mean, actually, another just nice detail here is that if you ever come to London, you know that in Piccadilly Circus, there's the statue, which is said to be the statue of Eros, but actually the sculptor, secretly, as it were, baptized it Ant-Eros, because this part of London was already known for rather excessive Eros and felt that the presence of the god Ant-Eros might be more useful. Just to say one more thing about the difference between Plotinus and Iamblichus before I hand over to you, Jane, and then I might add something about Christianity in the path. Just wanted to add that this difference between Plotinus and Iamblichus, the focus on Eros more in Plotinus, and perhaps philia more in Iamblichus, is also to do with their different sense of how we are in relation to the one. So for Plotinus, a movement of the mind is enough for gnosis, and that gnosis is brought by the mind returning to the one in Eros. But Iamblichus stresses the body and other aspects of reality too. And so for Iamblichus, theurgy becomes really crucial and important. Practices, which might be sacrifices, offerings, very materially based, as much as movements of the mind through intellectual perception. And so I think that that's why philia probably spoke more to Iamblichus, because this sense of friendship amongst entities that maybe seem quite disparate, the material and the immaterial, say. In Iamblichus, they become much more connected through mutual friendship, mutual bonds, which shows up in theurgic practice. And so in that practice reveals the one that's present in all things. And so Iamblichus becomes quite important in the Christian tradition and the discussion of sacraments, how in principle everything can become a sacramental presence of the divine in its friendship with the divine. So teasing that out perhaps just helps us understand how maybe the inner desire for return to the one is maybe that intellectual move, but the friendship that would gather the whole of life, even in material manifestation, and through theurgy return it to the one, takes us more to friendship. Jane, something about the spiritual path in the Sufi traditions, and then I'll just say a little bit more perhaps how Christianity takes this up as well.
Well, I think I'm going to give a slightly simpler exposition, actually, because I think within the tradition there isn't really that much discussion between the different types of love. Do you know, in the way that you're just describing between with the Greeks. I'm going to, you know, they tend to, I mean, as I say, ishq is seen as this very passionate love, whereas hub is is seen as the divine love. And I suppose it's a slightly calmer thing, a more steady kind of a growth that you'd be talking about. But I think the main way that the Sufi tradition would see love, again, as I said, it is this a kind of power or a motivating force. And in particular, it's the force which takes us beyond our limits. I mean, that's very much how they would see it. So, you know, within expositions, it always begins with poetry or expositions. You would always begin by a falling in love. You know, there'd be a moment, and then this falling in love initiates a kind of a process of yearning and longing, which over time moves us out of our comfort zone and towards, you know, union of divine, or as you said in your talk about Plato, it moves us ultimately to a glimpse of, you know, moving from physical beauties, you know, the physical beauty of the world, to the beauty, to a glimpse of the absolute beauty, which we will come on to, I think, when we're going to talk about creation and such like in the traditions. So I think there are a huge sort of corpus of Sufi poetry and epic tales which sort of revolve around this idea. But one that I thought a very famous one, which is in Attar's Conference of the Birds, which some people may be familiar with, is the story. There's a story of Sheikh Sinan, who, it is the longest story in the book. And, you know, this is not part of the frame story. These are little sort of, Attar does all these little asides of Sufi stories, which illustrates his point. And Sheikh Sinan is a sort of a master, a Sufi master. He's a pious man. He's very well respected. He has hundreds of disciples, and he's seen as a righteous figure. And then what happens to Sheikh Sinan? He's a very established sort of spiritual master. And then what happens with Sheikh Sinan is that he goes to Rome and he falls madly in love with a Christian girl, and who he meets by the wayside. And this leads him to abandon everything. He goes to Rome, he leaves his disciples, he turns into a wandering dervish who stands under the balcony of this Christian maiden, beseeching for her love. He goes into her service. She starts demanding things of him. I mean, he has to give up his religion. He has to, you know, he's humiliated. He has to drink wine. He ends up tending her pigs, which is the sort of ultimate humiliation for a Muslim. And then, you know, there's a turn, and he returns to himself. But the point of this story is that love takes him into different regions, and it's seen as a necessary completion for full realization, you know, that this propels you into this different space, and an ecstatic space, I suppose, normally is how it would be described. And you know, the other great story for this is the Sufi master Jalaluddin Rumi, who was again an orthodox teacher at a madrasa until he encountered the wandering mystic Shamsi Tabriz, who again opened. So this would, I suppose you'd say, this is the opening of the heart. Yes, it takes you beyond intellect, and it takes you beyond the limits of your religion and your culture and ordinary notions of piety. So, but this is how this is a great theme, and there's even such a thing called sort of sacred heresy, which is for the people who are led out of the conventions into this state of ecstatic love. And then Rumi, having been this very conventional teacher, becomes the great poet of love and longing within the Persian tradition. As you probably know, the beginning, the famous, I've got it written down here for you. The famous beginning of his great Mathnui begins, you know, listen to the reed forlorn, breathing ever since it was torn from its rushy bed, a strain of impassioned love and pain. 'Tis the flame of love that fired me, 'tis the wine of love that inspired me. So it opens up this intense longing which motivates this journey. So just to say one thing about this, it's important again that this yearning is very much seen as having its origin in God's yearning for us. And so there is a Hadith Qudsi, which is a saying in the prophetic tradition where, you know, God says to the Prophet Muhammad, our yearning for them is greater than their yearning for me. And this is, it's a Hadith Qudsi, which is said to David, who is the prophet of the Psalms and praise giving. So he says, our yearning for them, for my servants, is greater than their yearning for me. So again, the origin of this yearning is God's love for us and his desire for our return. And it's said, and in one of the hadiths on love, you know, that when they approach me by a cubit, I approach them by a cubit. So you've got this, the span is the hand and the cubit is from the elbow. So the point is that we take any step that we take towards him, then he takes a much greater step towards us. So all this love and longing is a kind of dynamic within a unity, if you see what I mean, that's taking place. It's a kind of dance that's going on between these two poles of creator and creation.
Yeah, so that takes me to reflecting on Christianity and at least one aspect of love within Christianity as a path, which is the role of love and suffering. I think within Christianity, you can sort of break it down into two senses, that either suffering arises because of our separation from God, or suffering arises because we're mistaken about the objects of our loving, and the suffering is a process of refinement until our love lands on the true object of its desire, which is God, that God was always bringing about anyway. So in the mystical tradition, the assumption is connection rather than separation, as perhaps in more mainstream Christian traditions. But nonetheless, there's still suffering because the right object of love has got to be found. And that can be painful because other things that we love must be let go of, perhaps carrying echoes of the stories that you were just discussing there, the opening of the heart that can be painful. I mean, the one story that where this shows up in Christian mysticism is in Dante's Divine Comedy, and the last part of the Purgatory. particularly from the seventh terrace, the last terrace on Mount Purgatory, and then into the Garden of Eden on the top of Mount Purgatory. This, in a way, is the most painful time for Dante, even though he's, you know, over halfway to paradise by this stage, and is in the light of love and the divine presence. And because there must be this final push, you might say, to correct his love and direct it aright before he can enter the paradise proper. And so on the seventh terrace, he has to go through the flames that will correct his love, and he's terrified. He considers even returning to the inferno at this point, and says that he would prefer to jump into molten glass than to enter the flames that would purge his love. And it's only when Virgil promises that he will meet Beatrice on the other side of the flames that he finally musters the courage to enter them. But even then, when he meets Beatrice, she meets him with a terrible chastising that is about correcting his love. She, for 2 cantos, mercilessly tells him that he was mistaken in the objects of his love, particularly in the way that he loved her. And I say mercilessly because the angels that have appeared at this point start singing a psalm of mercy to try and console Dante. And Beatrice tells the angels to be quiet. Dante must hear this properly. And so this is the kind of suffering within love that is part of the path, when you're well on the path, as opposed to the kind of suffering when you're not even sure that you're on the path at all. Another way it shows up in Christian mysticism is with this notion of the dark night of the soul, which both John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila in her way stress that the darkness comes about because what you loved before has been shown to not deliver what you really seek. And so you're thrown into a kind of darkness. But in the heart of that darkness is a shining presence that is the true object of your love, the divine presence that even in the suffering of the darkness of the soul reveals itself to be God's desire for you. And in one phase of the dark night of the soul, you must just hold on to that divine presence without understanding, without sight, and gradually it will work into you and orientate you towards it, and so the light returns on the other side of the dark night of the soul. But this process of suffering, which may go on for some time, is nonetheless within the overall path of love in this mystical tradition. You see it picked up in more modern writing as well. The thought that came to my mind when I was thinking about this was C.S. Lewis's notion of joy. And when he writes about joy, it's as much about a longing, something that you're aware of not fully comprehending, or maybe at times not comprehending at all, and yet somehow longing for, wanting, seeking. And so it's right to call it joy, because even in the darkness, it's known that it's the true object, the satisfaction, the fulfillment of the love which you have, which of course is also the love that's drawing you all along.
No, I think, yeah, I mean, I think there are, I suppose once one begins talking about the mystical journey in different traditions, then to a large extent you might expect it to be quite similar in certain ways, even though the metaphors or the allegory may be different. And, you know, I think, you know, what you're talking about, I mean, Rumi uses fire as the image. You know, he just in the poem I just read, he says the fire of love, that what does he say, that is the flame of love that fired me. And so, you know, he has this image throughout his work of fire, the fire of love, this sort of burning in longing, as being a purifying force, which is what it seems what you're saying about the Christian, about Dante as well. It's that which burns off the impurities and leaves you with a pure kind of love for as you say, the right love object. But it's interesting because both Attar and Ibn Arabi actually also refer to this state of, I don't refer to it really as a dark night, but both of them have passages where they describe a state of loving, of knowing that they're in love, but they don't know what the object of it is anymore. They say, I love, but I don't know who I'm loving. What is the object? So there's this state that's referred to within the tradition as a state of bewilderment, where you begin to lose all these distinct or precise or definite objects of desire. That's because you're moving towards attaching to the object, or a lot of the Sufi mystics would talk about love, love being an end in itself. You love for the sake of loving, not because there's necessarily an object of desire. It's a kind of state of being.
And Dante and the Spanish mystics in different centuries, of course, were very proximate to a lot of Islamic influences. And so
Absolutely,
one could go down a rabbit hole of speculation there. But acknowledging that there were no doubt were influences, let's just move on a bit to thinking about love from the divine perspective, perhaps, insofar as we can, and nudge, first of all, towards love in creation. And there's the question of whether creation is God's act of love. Just to check in with the Platonic tradition, certainly Plato would say that the demiurge, which in his likely story of the Timaeus, the demiurge is prompted by Eros. In fact, the demiurge means the power for the people, demos, as in people, and so it is acting in our best interests. And Eros fires the dynamic of creation's return by the Timaeus story. It's a likely story, Plato says, by which he means it's a kind of myth that may reveal certain truths to us, but he's not supposed to be presenting a kind of factual account of creation. But it's interesting that he puts Eros in his creation story in the Timaeus. In Christianity proper, I wanted to highlight two figures. One is Gregory of Nyssa, and then the other is Thomas Aquinas, to add some more to those thoughts about love and creation. In Gregory of Nyssa, he's very fascinating because he says, if I can collapse his subtle thoughts in not too crude a ways, that creation is always already in God. Much as we might say that the infinite contains the finite. The numbers 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 say are finite numbers, but they're contained in the infinite sequence of all even numbers. And so too, Gregory of Nyssa would say that creation's true place is within the divine already, part of the divine abundance, part of the divine love, and part of the divine endogenous manifestation. So what we tend to regard as the experience of creation, and even perhaps evolution now, in our more immediate world of appearance and perception, is the realization of creation, but from the point of view of time. And so for Gregory of Nyssa, creation has this eschatological dynamic to it as well, that it's in the fullness of time that we'll know creation as it truly is. Creation isn't primarily something that comes out of God and somehow becomes separate from the divine and must find its way back. That's just how it feels from our point of view. But in the fullness of time, at the eschatological moment, we're realized that we always already were in the divine as created beings. In the Western tradition, it's a bit different. So here's a thought from Thomas Aquinas that I hope teases out something that's not quite the same as Gregory of Nyssa. Because Thomas Aquinas, for example, at one point, he remarks, when we say that in him, i.e. in God, there is a procession of love. We show that God produced creatures not because God needed them, nor because of any other extrinsic reason, but on account of the love of his own goodness. So this is the agape love, the abundant love, that is at once desire and satisfaction. Again, another sort of distinction that's not really a difference that can be made from the temporal point of view as opposed to the eternal when it comes to love, is that we're inclined, Thomas would say, to experience love as a kind of lack, as a desire that maybe partially is filled but not wholly. But in creation full, Thomas says, this is actually the love that is full already, satisfied already, but because it's now known in the infinite eternity of the divine, is always fuller at the same time. And so it's a lack that doesn't wait, but a lack that just keeps receiving more and more and more. And so it's a desire that invites us more and more into the divine life, rather than the sense that we're returning to the divine life. And so that too, for Thomas, is the true meaning of creation. Another way of putting this is to say that creation is completely free for God, and hence his discussion there is that God doesn't need creation, but that creation is an expression of the divine love. And this is caught particularly in the phrase creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. It's one of the things, one of the elements that this expression is supposed to capture, that it's not because of something that God created as if God might need creation. No, God created for no reason at all. It was a manifestation always of the divine abundance, the divine love, which is to connect then very closely God creating out of love, but that love and God are part of the same being, and creation is an expression of that being as well. Jane.
Well, well, I think you would say, and as you know, I have been working on a book which is coming out not so distant future, I hope, by a man called Dom Sylvester Huidard, who made a connection, made the correlation between what Aquinas says and what Ibn Arabi says. So I think there's probably a huge overlap, and probably the huge overlap, I mean, apart from sort of realization and insight, I mean, because both drew very much from the same traditions. I mean, Ibn Arabi, the Islamic mystical tradition, drew enormously from the Neoplatonic traditions. So I haven't said that so far, but I mean, it's certain you can see the traces of it all the time that you're speaking. I can see the traces of that in the tradition put into different language. I mean, so as you know, Ibn Arabi places love absolutely central to the process of creation, and there's a Hadith Qudsi that is he places at his center of his creation theory, which is again God saying, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known, so I created the world that I might be known. So here it's very similar to what you're talking about, that God created the world out of love, not out of necessity. I mean, that's a very important theological point. He did it simply out of love. And I think this sense of this abundance, I think we would make quite a strong correlation between, this is hub here, this is this pure hub love, and agape, this is an overflowing love. The hidden treasure is, understood to be because the one and absolute and beauty are synonymous. And so this is an overflowing of absolute beauty, which simply needs, desires for expression. Yes, to show itself, and the motivation is love, and this is the motive for the creation of the world. And so whereas you're putting it in terms of goodness, Ibn Arabi makes this correlation always between love and knowledge. So these two always go together. So the motive is love, but the fruit is knowledge. And so the purpose, this sort of dual sense. And so when we're talking about knowledge, we're not talking actually in an academic sense, or even, but we talk more about experiential knowledge. So we would say that everything in creation is a way, is a mode by which this expression of beauty and this knowledge of what that beauty is in a sort of external projection sort of happens. So, absolutely within the Islamic tradition, the world is understood to be a manifestation of God, an appearance of this beauty in manifest form. And so for Ibn Arabi, one of the things to mention about the consequences of this is that everything that happens to us in the world is actually fundamentally motivated by love and by God's love for us. And so, this is a big subject, because of course, when you first hear it, people say, well, what about all the suffering and all the negative things that happen to us? How can you say that everything that happens in the world is fundamentally because of love? But Ibn Arabi, the way that Ibn Arabi explains it is that this is actually a hidden truth, that we have to dig down below the level of superficial appearance to understand that everything that happens to us and everything that happens in the world is actually because of this manifestation of love and the desire to be known. And so, we'd all have it fairly simple. We'd all know that there are certain things which have happened to us. So being dumped by a lover, for instance, which causes us enormous suffering at the time, and we think it's the most dreadful thing that ever happened to us. But in the fullness of time, and as life goes on, we can see that actually it was for our better, it was our best interests, it was a good thing that this happened to us. And that's an easy example. So for him, this coming to understand that everything is motivated by love is a very, very deep mystery. But this is part of the spiritual path to uncover, to come to this kind of realization.
So maybe I could just keep it on the Sufi understanding. Would you therefore say that they say God is love? Would it be as direct as that?
No, we talked about this, and I think you wouldn't say that. I think the point is that they say that God is beauty, that it's the beauty, it's the absolute beauty, which they would say. And so one of the things they say is that love is the movement of beauty. It's what's self-subsistent is beauty, but love is the movement of this beauty. It's the movement of expression of beauty. I think that's slightly different from what you were saying about the understanding of the Trinity.
Yes, so that's right. So within the Trinitarian conception of the divine, you could say that God is love because the movement between the three persons of the Trinity would be a movement of love. So maybe there's a little connection there a bit in terms of the movement, but within the Trinitarian conception, don't want to just elide these things because it is different. There's the origin or the source that of its nature overflows even within the divine life into the second person. But because it's within the divine life, that overflow is still fully divine. And so the second person of the Trinity is divine, and that overflow is divine too. So that will be where the third person, so-called the Spirit, is acknowledged as well. And so within that inner dynamic of divine life expressed in Trinitarian formulas would be the presence of love. It's not love, I think, as we perhaps use the word feeling and so on. It's rather the love that is the full realization. It's referring back to this notion of agape again. And I think this is one of the reasons why agape is so present in the New Testament, because in a way you can see it as an attempt to try to understand what this new agape love might really be trying to capture, given that it's hardly in older Greek texts at all, and then suddenly becomes very dominant in Christian texts. There's the famous story, for example, about when Jesus asks Peter 3 times whether he loves him, Peter having previously denied Jesus 3 times. And so when Jesus appears after the resurrection, he asks Peter 3 times whether he loves him. And the first 2 times that Jesus asks Peter, he uses the word agape, and Peter replies with the word philia. Peter replies with friendship. And so the 3rd time Jesus asks Peter whether he loves him, he uses the word friendship too. And Peter says, yes, I love you, with the word friendship. And this is much discussed in the biblical scholarship as to the meaning of this, as it were, Jesus using agape twice and then switching to friendship, philia at the end, whilst Peter uses friendship without. And one way of expressing it is that Jesus realizes that Peter doesn't understand agape yet, and so accommodates Peter's understanding of love and so use of friendship, because of agape having this divine connotation that Peter doesn't fully know of yet, and so can only respond as a friend of God. But I think it's also, it captures something of the evolution of the notions of love in the Christian tradition. And so, agape is expressed as the greatest love, the love that's in the greatest commandment. And also agape is the love in the famous passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where Paul talks about the greatest of these being love. And so there's a kind of push towards understanding love from the divine perspective, even as other loves are on occasion at least referred to, like philia. Eros, incidentally, is not in the New Testament at all, but that's another story which we'll come to shortly, I think. Does anyone, do you want to add any more on this sort of discussion of creation and divine love? Because I thought we could move perhaps more to things like charity and so on, the more ethical side of love. But just to make sure that you'd said what you wanted to say.
Well, I think, just to say that I think that, from what you're saying about agape, what would be said within the tradition is that, God's love is an unconditional form of love, that he loves his creation, for its own sake. It's not a conditional form of love, which is when Ibn Arabi is talking about everything being love, it's much more talking about it as being this kind of creative movement. The movement of creation is being motivated like this, rather than being, say, it would be a love which would be conditional on how we are or whether we love him or something of that nature. I mean, that's a different kind of relationship when you're talking about this cosmic principle of love. It applies to everything, everywhere. So it is, I think there's a correlation with what you're saying about agape, is that it's completely unconditional.
Okay, well, look, let's move to more mundane, earthly manifestations of this love in our lives, because one of the areas we wanted to talk about, because I think there are nuanced differences here, are traditions of charity and being charitable, traditions of pastoralia, care for others, traditions of hospitality too, these ways in which love shows up between human beings. Jane, do you want to say how they're understood within certainly Sufism? Because this is very interesting to me, how they're conceived of and feel sort of different in a way from what might be regarded as a very unproblematic sense in Christianity, that charity is good, yeah, pastoralia is good, yeah, being hospitable is good. Yeah, even if it's hard to say. But there's a bit more nuance from what we were talking about before.
Well, I think that, within Islam, all those things would be considered good. Looking after the others, charity, hospitality, certainly charity in the sense of what you would call zakat, giving to the poor in terms of money or support, is actually a religious duty. Everybody would do that. Hospitality is culturally an enormously important thing within the Islamic world, and in fact spiritually as well. I mean, it would be very, especially associated with the prophet Abraham, if you remember, who entertained the angels, in exactly the same story in the Quran as it is in the Bible. So all of these things are important within it. But I think what Islam doesn't have, which is specific to Christianity, is this injunction to love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, I think that's what came out of our previous conversation, and it doesn't have that same sense. I mean, I thought about this and I thought, well, there is a sense within Sufism in the sense of identity. I mean, if you see that everything in the world is actually a manifestation of God, then you get there is a real sense in which you understand that the identity of everything is therefore God, and so my identity is the same as your identity. So there's this breaking down of separation between different things, and certainly between different people, is part of the mystical tradition, but it's not sort of specifically said, love your neighbor as yourself. The one thing that people quote, which is perhaps equivalent, is called the Hadith of the Ihsan. And Ihsan is a complex term. It basically comes from a root meaning beauty. And it talks of, and this is, so the Ihsan is the doing beautiful acts, doing beautiful things, doing beautiful actions. And that can be interpreted as a very, if you like, ordinary religious level of doing charitable acts. But it can also be understood at a more mystical level as actually the movement of how do we beautify the world? How do we bring this principle of beauty into the world? And so the Hadith of the Ihsan is, again, as if the divine is speaking, and he says, I was sick and you did not visit me. I was hungry and you did not feed me. So this is bringing the divine identity, giving an immanent aspect. So the understanding that when you're doing a charitable act, or when you're doing an act of care to another person, you're actually doing it towards God, not in a sense of a separate person. So there's an awful lot of stories in the Sufi canon about beggars and all the nuances of what can happen, how you give and such like. But one of the dangers that the Sufi mystics are aware of is kind of spiritual pride. And so they're, in a way, sometimes wary of acts of charity, because it's as if you're putting yourself into a superior situation to somebody else. You're acting like God towards them. So there's a tradition that they say, that you always give to God. So so it says that when someone gives to a beggar, then God puts his hand in between. And so you give, your act is towards God, and then God gives to the beggar. And in that sense, you kind of keep this sense of this, which is very important within tradition, of not attributing, acknowledging that God is everything. God is the creator of everything, and that we are completely dependent on him. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's this particular thing I think makes a big difference to Christianity in practice on the ground. I think this thing of love your neighbor as yourself.
And I think another difference that shows up in you might say the quality of the act, rather than just the act as a kind of behavior,
Yes,
the inner dynamic of the act. It happens in Christianity in the post-Reformation period, where there's a shift in emphasis in Western Christianity away from the sense that we are participating in the life of God, and so therefore our behavior reflects that participation, which would be the reason for loving your neighbor. Because with the reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin, at least, all of this sense that we can participate in the life of God is called into question because, as Calvin puts it, of our utter depravity. The sense of separation from the divine life within our lives is stressed. Now, this, of course, for the reformers is responded to by God because of the sacrifice of Jesus that reaches across this separation and so saves us. But it has this knock-on effect because instead of a charitable act being one that is part of the divine life, because God gives to us, it's seen as needing a quality of costly sacrifice starts to come into acts of charity and generosity and so on, because of the cost that God paid for our salvation. And so you have quite a new thing that I think starts to show up, that your giving must cost you something quite dramatic, otherwise it's sort of not really worth that much. And so you get these agonized discussions about what material goods you should give up. Guilt starts to become part and parcel of the discussion about charity in modern Christianity, because since the Reformation, the idea that there's a separation between us and God, we can't trust ourselves in our relationship to God, but the immensely costly sacrifice that God made in order to bring us back must be mirrored in our costly sacrificial acts too. Now, there's a pushback from this as well, so just a sort of another thought to throw in here, which is that actually I rather like the way that the Catholic philosopher Ivan Illich expressed it when he was reflecting on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he wanted to say that this parable, where the Samaritan after the first two priests is the one that tends to the person who's been beaten up and is lying in the ditch, Illich said that the Samaritan wasn't acting out of this sense of kind of dutiful sacrifice, putting himself out of his way in order to help someone else, but was acting out of the inner freedom that his love for the person in the ditch brought him. And so that again adds a different nuance here, that the Samaritan, unlike the first two that passed by on the other side, wasn't bound by a tussle. What's the dutiful thing to do? Should I do this? Should I not do that? Can it be a genuine act of charity, or is it just some kind of gesture? No, the Samaritan was actually free of all that again. And so like God could just respond spontaneously in the moment out of love, out of abundance. And so this is a kind of corrective, I think, in the reading of the Good Samaritan, certainly in Ivan Illich's account, which I like that sense that charity and freedom are actually intimately connected rather than, say, charity and duty. You mentioned too, or at least you touched on, what you might call the problem of idolatry in all this. When you talked about God's hand comes in between your hand and the one that you're giving to, so that you're giving to God. And I just wondered, is there something here to say about love towards saints, say, and devotion towards those who express the God and the qualities of God? Because certainly, in Christianity, particularly in medieval piety, Dante, of course, is a huge figure here. There is a whole upsurge of devotion to saints, particularly to the Virgin, and even new words come into English as a result. Words like sweetness, loveliness, mercifulness. These are all medieval words which originally were expressive of this loving devotion to the Virgin Mary and elsewhere. And it's very striking that at the end of the Paradise, when Dante is almost at the point of perceiving his unity with the divine, it's the Virgin who Bernard prays to at this point. And Bernard's one of the great medieval writers on devotion and love and the divine. And Bernard sings of the paradoxes of the Virgin, how she was both mother and sister to her son and so on. But I think what's happening at this point is that the devotion to the Virgin prepares Dante's capacity to know the divine being born in him, even as he is knowing himself as always having been born in the divine. So, you know, the significance of Mary, of course, is that Jesus was born in her, even as she was already a child of God. And so this is another way of expressing the kind of mystical unity that Dante is almost on knowing, you know, is fulfilled in himself, that the Virgin is the penultimate step, because in her he can see the business of the divine being born in him and knowing that he's enwombed in the divine as well. So this sense of devotion and love of the saints as part of the path to God is very important as well in these medieval Christian mystical traditions. Would you see anything like that at all?
Oh goodness, yes. I'm aware of the time actually, so I think it's 6:20, so I think we're going to have a break. But I just say that yes, I mean, you do see that all over the Islamic world. You especially, except where in these more fundamentalist states where there's a specific attack upon this reverence for saints. But if you go to somewhere like Turkey or Morocco or any of the more the places where more traditional culture is still operational, you find the tombs of saints everywhere, and they're absolutely full of people visiting them. But I think it's, you know, Islam is tremendously conscious of idolatry. I mean, the fundamental testament of the faith is I attest that there is no God but God. And so this adherence to the unity of the real, the unity of God, is a really strong thing that runs all the way through the mystical traditions. And so there is tremendous reverence and devotion to the saints, and their tombs are looked after and people visit and they take things and everything. But there's always this precaution of never associating them with God. So association with God, or making a partner to God, is the kind of primary spiritual error within Islam. And so, you know, so in this devotion, there is always the understanding that that these people are like conduits, you know, their means of compassion and mercy to the world, and that's what they are, if you see what I mean. Not only, you know, that's what how a saint, someone who's designated as a saint, is seen. But there's always the precaution that's said in some of the prayers that you would say when you go, to release them from the oppression of being associated with God. And that would be equally the same. I mean, it's nice to end on a note on the Virgin Mary, who of course is also very, very important within the Islamic tradition. She is the only woman who is given a chapter in the Quran to herself, and she is a really, really important figure. But, you know, again, she is seen as a place of, if you like, the place of this pure love, in which there is no association with anything except God. It's an untainted, pure love that is embodied with her, pure receptivity to divine, with no hint of ever sort of attributing existence to anything else, especially oneself.
I wanted us to have said something about sexual love and friendship, because it's an area where there's interesting difference. In terms of Western Christianity, erotic love, as known in sexual love, is problematic, partly because Eros doesn't appear in the New Testament, so there's little to go by, and partly because of St. Paul, who makes these comments such as marry if you must. And so there's a kind of sense that asceticism and celibacy are somehow preferable. And this plays out all into the modern Western world amongst Roman Catholics, say, about debates around contraception. In the Anglican Church, it's moved on a bit more to homosexuality. The uncoupling of sex from procreation in the 20th century with contraception is a big problem, in other words, because ever since the time of Augustine, sexual acts, whilst part of fallen human nature, were redeemed by the potential that they could lead to procreation, which of course is therefore to be mirroring divine creation. Now, that said, in mysticism, the Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible, with its erotic verse, has always been very important. And then even in Luther, actually, there's a strange thing in Martin Luther, because whilst on the one hand, he felt that everything we do is already disastrously depraved and separate from God, in another move, that actually brings in a kind of freedom, because he sort of says, well, look, all sorts of things for our comfort therefore become permissible, because there's no way that we can redeem ourselves anyway. Asceticism doesn't appeal to him. And so there is quite an enjoyment of sexual love and marriage in Lutheranism. Do you want to just talk a bit about that in the Islamic Sufi world, and then maybe just add a thought on friendship as well, Jane?
Okay, well, it is an area of huge difference, because Islam doesn't have this concept of, it does not embrace either asceticism or celibacy, at least not formally, and it does not have this kind of I'm not going to be critical, but just say it does not have this great sense of sin and having to repay for some sort of debt for sin. The Quran is full of, although in some ways it's quite harsh, is also full of injunctions to enjoy the good things of life. And so, you know, marriage, family, good food, all of those things. There are illicit pleasures listed in the Quran, which people are enjoined to enjoy, and sex is one of them. And it doesn't, it's part of life. There are stories of saints who have rather a tendency towards asceticism, actually, and who are then ordered by God to go and get married because it's required of them. And, you know, there's even a sense that Ibn Arabi would even celebrate the act of love, and he does talk about it as being for the person who undertakes this in knowledge, is actually a contemplation, that it can be a contemplation of the divine. So there isn't this same problem of sex. There is, again, the problem of association or enjoying anything other than God. And so within the tradition, it's a legal requirement for everybody that after coitus, you do a full ablution. So that's a legal requirement. And the reason is that the pleasure of sex is so great that you might be tempted to forget about God. And so after you return, you wash away that temptation. And so again, it's the question of idolatry, of forgetting the oneness of God, which is seen as the possibility. I don't want to go on too much about this, actually. There's a great deal that you could say, because the whole of the Islamic poetic tradition is really a celebration of love. Usually it's quite difficult to tell, you know, in many cases whether, you know, that very much like Dante and Beatrice, really, you know, whether you're talking about a physical person or whether you're talking about these two things are not separated in the same way as they are within Christianity. But we'll keep it brief.
Yeah, well, look, and just briefly about friendship, because again, It's interesting. Well, actually, the ambivalence is even within Western Christianity itself. You know, broadly, you might say that following Augustine, there's quite a wariness of friendship between human beings. This is because in Book 4 of his Confession, Augustine explains how he loved one of his peers as a young man, and then this chap dies, and it's very moving. It leaves Augustine bereft for about a decade, actually, and then he realizes that he loved a man as if they were God, and so that casts a shadow over friendship between human beings in those that follow the Augustinian sense. It's corrected in the medieval period with Aquinas, and then particularly with Aelred of Rievaulx, actually, as well, where friendship is described more as a kind of school of love, in which we can learn of what love is, refine our love, and so be made more capable of the divine love. And so friendship plays a role in that way. And then just also to add, of course, that it's not just love of friends, but love of enemies that must be woven in here as well. And this is in Plato. Socrates says, you know, what is the value in a way of loving your friends? Of course, that happens. You really know of love when you can love your enemies as well. But friendship is a very important word too in the Sufi tradition, isn't it?
Well, in two senses, actually, just to be brief again, because this is another huge subject. I mean, yes, I think, again, I mean, obviously, in the St. Augustine's case, you know, within the Sufi tradition, that would be, discussed that it was an attachment to a form rather than to the divine that had gone on. I mean, and so that would be equally problematic, I think, between it. There's a famous thing when the Prophet Muhammad died and Abu Bakr stepped up and he said, you know, those who love the Prophet Muhammad grieve, but for those who love God, follow me. You know, so even at that very beginning of the tradition with the Prophet himself, it's made clear that the adherence is to God, not to the Prophet as a figure or as a human being. So that kind of, again, it's always within Islam, it's always the question of devoting towards God and making these fine distinctions between things. But I mean, the important thing to say about friendship within the Islamic tradition is that, or within the Sufi tradition, is that the friend, wali, is considered to be a divine name. And so God is considered the friend. And a saint, what we normally call saints, all these people whose tombs they are referred to as walis. Wali doesn't mean saint in the sacred sense. The word for holy is from roots of kudusa, in Islam. Wali means friend. So the way that these people are referred to as friends of God, that's how they're seen. Yeah, and the most common way within the Sufi circles to refer to God would be to refer to him as the friend. So there's this sense, and this sense of the friendship, I think, is very much of companionship. And so there is the Quranic saying that he is with you, God, is with you wherever you are. So there's this sense of the companionship, that God is always our companion. And that is why he is referred to as the friend. And this is called the withness or the ma'iyah. And it's the kind of awareness of the constant presence of God. And also something that we haven't talked about so much is that this love of God is very much the divine love from God. I've talked about it as a cosmic principle, but there's also the understanding that there is specific caring love for each individual. So this sense of he is the friend in the sense that you would use a friend. Yes, he's my companion on the way. He's looking out for me. Yes, he's the person I can lean on. So this concept of friendship is much more directed towards this thing, that thing of God, that regarding God as a friend. And so I know that this, and it is in the sense of companionship, and it's also, there's a kind of permission to it, because of course the problem of saying that you're a friend of God is that you're assuming friends are equals. You know, so you're kind of assuming that maybe you're an equal to God if you can be his friend. But there are these little passages in the Quran which embody a divine promise of reciprocity between the human being and God. And one of them, you know, there's one that's called Mujib al-Dawa, and he says, ask me and I will answer you. And then he says, remember me and I will remember you. So in the Quran, you know, so this is often interpreted, you know, make me your companion and I will make you my companion. And so there's this sense that this is a kind of permitted reciprocity, if you see what I mean. It's not presumption from the part. That's the basis of it.
Thank you. Look, I'll just link back to where I began with Aristotle and Plato, and then we'll come to questions, because it reminded me of a difference there, that Aristotle's very clear you can't be friends with gods because of the inequality, and friendship must always have an equal sense of give and take, and how could we possibly have that with the gods? But Plato thought differently. Plato thought that we can be friends with the gods because of this quality of love that has this transformational hold on us, that its very excessiveness leads us to places that we didn't know were even possible. And so we can become friends with the gods because of the divine within us. And awakening to that is very much part of the action of love.
Well, it's a good question, actually. I suppose the first thing, I'm not going to offer to just answer it perfectly, but I think the first thing that I would say is that, you know, there is a question of patience and trust in God, you know, which, though they say there's always in any, you know, so that it is the case that this, or at least give it a chance that this might be the case. I mean, the way that Ibn Arabi talks about this, when he talks about, you know, how we are with these matters, he says, you know, we have this huge tendency to sort of immediate reaction. So when bad things happen to us, we have a perfectly natural visceral reaction, you know, against any kind of pain or suffering. And that's what we first come out with. But, you know, what he's kind of saying is that if you can go beyond that, if you can settle that, then actually you can begin to see other meanings. And that's what the time does that very often. You know, you have this sort of immediate reaction, and then over time you see that there was something else or some other dimension to it. So Ibn Arabi doesn't give specific kind of advice on this in the way that, say, we have so much wisdom now from other traditions and from psychotherapy and everything about how we do this. But it's very much, I think, pointing towards the same idea that we should, you know, give the possibility that there are other dimensions to this a chance. Because, you know, as we all know, and Mark will know as a psychotherapist, there are two things that happens. There's the original pain, the original distress or reaction, and then there's what we do to compound it. You know, we build on that. So we say, oh, this terrible thing has happened, and then we build edifices or emotional chain reactions going on from that. So I think what Ibn Arabi is suggesting is just what would be suggested with any of the other traditions, that we open ourselves to the possibility that there might be deeper movements going on, and that does have a great effect on how we react. What would you say, Mark?
Yeah, my mind turned to William Blake, and because he talks about what he calls wars of love, and it's connected to his well-known saying about mental fight, which is about taking the arrows of our desire and building Jerusalem. And so there's this sense that love does involve a struggle, at least insofar as we know it here on earth. But he couples it always to forgiveness. I know of no other gospel, he says, than the gospel of forgiveness. And so the point about forgiveness is not that it forgets, but that it creates the space always for transformation. And so whilst there is a struggle, and it's one that might be very costly, nonetheless, when it's a war of love, as opposed to, say, a war of hate or something else, it is part of the transformation of ourselves and the world and the whole of creation, in fact, into eternity, as Blake puts it, when there's this possibility always of forgiveness, so that what's happened doesn't hold us down, but instead lifts us up. Now look, that again, that's only kind of like a partial answer, but I suppose it says that the reason why this phrase wars of love stands out to me is that it shows that love can get its hands dirty, put it like that, which I'm sure everyone would agree with as well.
I suppose I'd want to add, actually, having heard what you say, that also when you say how we seek, I mean, I think it's true that from what we've said in both traditions, the great quality of love is transformational. I mean, that's what we mean when we say that it propels us into different places, which goes beyond our normal modes of behavior. So, I mean, I suppose I would say probably, there's really nothing, there's no excuse for ever not acting oneself out of love, of abandoning that position, because, Ibn Arabi say it is so fundamental to the world. This is the fundamental movement of the world. And so if one can do that, as you say, stay with that principle, then it's potentially transformational.
And to that, from the Platonic tradition and certainly in the Christian tradition, would be added that the greatest sacrifice that the mortal figure can make, i.e. dying for love, is part of that as well. So Socrates can respond to the power of the political presence in Athens that has sentenced him to death by welcoming his death, because he knows and loves the good. And so the manner of his death will speak to his fellow citizens of the good that they otherwise wouldn't see. And of course, in Christianity, the figure of Christ dying on the cross speaks of God's love that by being in the world transcends the world at the same time, by showing another kind of power, in inverted commas, that would be called the love that that we can never be separated from. Okay, so I think in Christianity, the future is one of continuity with the world as we know it now, but also of discontinuity. Something will pass away. And well, again, to refer to William Blake, he talks about how our loving creativity in the here and now is building what he calls Golgonooza, which is the kind of way of life, form, city, so it's collective as well as individual, that can know and transmit much of eternity. But we must never forget that Golgonooza will also crumble and fall. And we know this almost day by day, as much as over longer periods of time in the collective sense, that our efforts to build are also met with crumbling, whether it's active destruction or just falling away. And he thinks that's really important, because this is recognizing the eschatological dimension that's so strong in Christianity, that it's only in the end times that the fullness will be known. Now, of course, the end times can then be conceived of in all sorts of ways, But I find it something of a relief to know that there is a discontinuity as well as a continuity, because that allows for things to seemingly go very wrong, tragedy, and hold on to the fact that ultimately it's a divine comedy. To remember Dante again, who of course travels through the tragedy, and only then begins to realize how the comedy can connect to the whole of reality. But maybe there's something that's useful there, that I'm sure that there is collective elements to this, and there can be movements that release a spirit, and so there is what you might call progress. But I don't think that progress is a sort of steady return to the divine, if with setbacks. I think there will be a radical discontinuity, but we become more capable of eternity by the way that we live separately and individually and collectively in this life. Something like that.
Well, I certainly wouldn't disagree with any of that, but I think I'd say, so what does come to me to say is that in terms of movements and collective action is really the understanding that it is love that is the kind of motivating or force that moves. And I think in the present day, I think there is a problem there, because there's a lot of understanding of what's wrong, and there's not much identification of what actually we love collectively, if you see what I mean. So a lot of ecological movements, a lot of political movements are very, ecological movements are framed in terms of, we're against climate change, we're against fossil fuels, we're trying to save the world. Whereas actually these feelings don't have the power. I mean, that's what, within Islam, I don't know if we've conveyed that, but I mean, love is a strong force. Do you know? It has this, love is this force which has the power to actually catapult us, way beyond our limits. It will carry us. And so I think there's a lot of negative reaction, what we don't want, movements like Extinction Rebellion or something moving against what we don't want. I don't think we've yet found that articulation of what it is that we love and that we're aiming for. And I think, what was it, the Pythagorean, that you mentioned it, going way back to the Greeks, is that the love of truth, the love of goodness, the love of beauty. These things are true motivating forces, but I don't think in the present day we've quite formulated them in a kind of contemporary terms yet, that kind of unites us. So that would be my reaction to what you say. So I suppose we go back to something, I suppose it was Socrates that said that actually everybody is in pursuit of happiness and beauty, but as we've said, it can attach to the wrong objects, and so I would say that these people who are embracing martyrdom, there is I think one has to acknowledge there is a love there. They are loving something. I myself would say it's misguided.
Yeah, we think they're going to get a reward, actually.
They do, yeah, yes. But I mean, it is it's an interpretation of the tradition, and certainly the hadith that the Sufi tradition would go for, was that because Islam was founded on the jihad, on battle, but Muhammad at the end of one of the battles came back and he said, we've come, that was the lesser jihad. The greater jihad is the battle against ourselves. So is the interior battle for wisdom and for conformity in this way that we've been talking about. So it is a certain level of interpretation, and I'm sure that it is motivated in a way by the love of God.